From beautiful Bath, England, Axiom Mystery School presents The Great Rethinking, Changing Our Personal and Planetary Destiny.
Well, Thomas More is a psychotherapist, writer, and lecturer who lives in New England with his wife and 2 children. He's published many articles in the areas of archetypal and Jungian psychology, mythology, and the arts. I'm losing my voice. Uh-oh. Right at the last moment here. His books include The Planets Within, Rituals of the Imagination, Dark Eros, Care of the Soul, Soulmates, and Meditations. Thomas is editor to Blue Fire, HarperCollins, an anthology of the writings of James Hillman. Dr. More lived as a monk in a Catholic religious order for 12 years. He has a PhD in religious studies from Syracuse University, an MA in theology from the University of Windsor, an MA in musicology from the University of Michigan, and a BA in music and philosophy from DePaul University. He is a leading lecturer and writer in North America and in Europe in the areas of archetypal psychology, mythology, and the arts, and it's a great honor to have with us today Dr. Thomas More.
It's been a while since we started. I forget everything I was going to say to you. I'll try to remember. When I was first asked to come here, I thought of this phrase of the conference titled The Great Rethinking. I would probably say the Great Reimagining. And I thought to myself, what is the most important thing I would want to say about rethinking the way we're living to help relieve the misery on the planet? What would I want to say? And the answer that came to me was something that surprised me, and it may surprise you. My thought was that the reason that we have such misery is the repression of pleasure. The repression of pleasure and the repression of sexuality. So that's what I want to talk to you about. It's not too different from what Satish was saying. It flows directly from his thoughts about pleasure and sensuality. But before I get specifically into that, I'd like to just lay out a little bit some of the basic ideas about soul that I work with and have worked with for about 20 years. I'll try to pack 20 years into about 3 minutes if I can, and tell you what that is. But before I do that even, I want to tell you something else whose relevance you may not see right away. I don't know what your experience is, but mine, ever since I started school, was when I attend a lecture, I spend probably at least maybe, 1/8 to 1/4 of the time in daydream. Do you do that? I mean, you look like a pretty serious audience. I don't know. And I hate to admit that, but I do. I daydream. And I want to tell you about some of the daydreams I've had here while the lectures were going on. And I hope that the lecturers understand that this is part of my pleasure. Well, the first thing that happened was with the afternoon we were sitting around talking in groups. You know, there's a picture of William Pitt in the back here, a very large painting, probably one of those that David White was referring to. Well, what happened was he came down off that painting, and he saw what was going on here, and he was very upset. And he speaks in a very loud, authoritative voice. And he was pounding a staff on the floor, and he was calling for his men to come and do something about this. And at that point, when the police started coming, I started paying attention to what was going on. And I thought you should know that. A second thing, there was another lecture taking place. I forget which one it was. And suddenly, we all were wearing women were wearing gowns and men were in formal dress, and there was an orchestra up here, and we were waltzing in this beautiful place. And I liked that one, so I let that one go for quite a while. And the third daydream I had was during Tim's presentation, and everyone who was on these paintings in the room gathered up in that little balcony there where all those seats are, kind of a loggia, and they just sat up there and listened to Tim very intently and with a great deal of pleasure. I thought that was quite nice to have that audience. I just want you to know that those people are listening to you. And I'll tell you one more thing about this. I'll try to explain all this later. I mean, it has some relevance. I may not get time to, but I'll try. The other thing is that many years ago, a novel came to me, and I started writing this novel. It was about a psychiatrist who was quite bizarre, very unusual. And one of the things he did was, whenever he got to his office in the morning, he'd go to his desk, and behind his desk was a large painting of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And some mornings when he would arrive there, it was just a painting and it was fine. And he would just look at the painting and sit down and start doing his work. But many mornings he arrived, Adam and Eve were walking in this garden, and he would talk to Eve especially. In fact, he only talked to Eve. I don't know why. In novels, you don't know why people are doing these things. And he called her mother. And would say, "Mother, could you help me today with what I'm doing?" And she would talk to him. And anyway, I'm sure that's why you wanted to hear me talk tonight, to tell about these things. But it does, as I say, it does have some relevance. Now, what I wanted to tell you about with the soul is that I get my thoughts about the soul from the past. I really live in the past. I don't live in the present. I'm sorry, I don't live in the present. Those people talking about living in the now, I don't. I never have. I live in the past. And whenever I'm at futurist conferences, I always tell people I'm a pastist. I prefer the past. I wish, I lived in the 1500s, and I try to live in the 1500s. I dialogue with the dead. I don't dialogue with the living very much. I'm not terribly sociable, but I'm quite sociable with the dead. So, well, it's true. I'm sorry, it's true. And so my friends, the ones I rely on for my thoughts, are very dead. And I start with Plato, for example. I consider myself a Platonist, a Neoplatonist. But Plato, because what did Plato do? He talked about the soul in all of his books. He talked about the soul, psyche, the soul. And for example, too, then he expanded on his ideas of the soul. In his book, The Symposium, he discussed the nature of love in a beautiful setting of people having dinner and drinking together, and each person standing up to say what love is. It's a wonderful, beautiful statement. And there's a tradition among people who are Platonists to celebrate that symposium every November 7th. And on November 7th in our home, we gather our friends, we have dinner, and someone stands up and says what they think love is all about. And that's how we celebrate Plato's birthday. It's a beautiful, beautiful tradition. Now, after him, there was Plotinus, who was the founder of Neoplatonism, who wrote the Aeneads, which were, it's a long collection of chapters, really, of a large piece of work, all about the soul and beauty and spirituality and the relation of God and the soul. It's magnificent. And then, for me, the next stage, see, I think of my friends now in the past. The next group of Neoplatonists that really speak to me were the people who gathered in Florence in the 15th century, and they had what they called a Platonic Academy. And they would gather in a room, a beautiful room, just outside Florence in a place called Careggi. And they would have dinner and they would drink a little bit, and then they would talk about the soul. And the head of this group was Marsilio Ficino, F-I-C-I-N-O, Marsilio Ficino. And his gathering of these Platonists to talk about the soul was incredibly influential. I mean, he had a lot of interesting things to say about the soul, and I want to tell you what some of those are. But his influence lasted for 200 or 300 years, even up to the present, really. So this little gathering of people talking about soul, and whenever I gather with people like you today, I have this sense that this is a recreation of the Plato's Academy. We are here now in a different place, but we are doing the same thing. We're gathered for this hour to talk about the soul. It's like resurrecting that fantasy of Ficino once more, to talk about the soul and various aspects of the life of the soul. Now, what Ficino said was that, these are the very first words I ever read of his. He said that there are three things in life. There's the mind, there's the body, and there's the soul. Ficino was not interested in mind-body or mind-body-spirit. That was not his way of looking at things. He saw the mind, the body, and the soul. He says in this first sentence that I ever read of his, he says that if all you have is the mind, the mind will not be drawn to the body. There's no way. The mind can't get in touch with the body. And if all you do is focus on the body, the mind won't be involved. What you need is the soul in the middle. And he interchanges the word mind and spirit sometimes. Because people, his group of followers believe that the mind, the work of the mind, and all of our thoughts and this intellectual endeavor is a spiritual one. That it's a spiritual thing that we're doing there. So the soul was something different. The soul is not the spirit. It's not at all the same as the spirit. In the spirit, we're trying to know a lot. We had a lot of spiritual presentations in the past couple of days, in Ficino's sense. We've had a lot of presentations of looking at the cosmos and thinking about the future and evolution, all of that. From his point of view, that's a very spiritual activity that we're doing there. But the soul is something else. The soul is something that is more intimate. It is embedded in ordinary life, in our ordinary situations, our ordinary problems especially, our relationships, our work, our attempts to travel, to get somewhere, try to get home. All of that is the life of the soul. It's not up there on the mountain peaks. It's not at the end of evolution. It's right there in our everyday minute-to-minute activities. That's where the soul is. And he was interested in finding ways to care for, in fact, he used that phrase, care for that soul, the soul. And his thoughts were, I can't describe all of it, but I'll tell you two things. First of all, he thought that the faculty of the soul is imagination, and that images are the way the soul shows itself and develops, through images. The images of dream, the images of art. Maybe you'll begin slowly now to see why I wanted to talk about these paintings coming to life. That art for Ficino was not representing something from this real world onto a canvas. Art was magic, is what he called natural magic. So there were two things of Ficino that he said the soul worked by: imagination and magic. Now today, you can't get away talking about magic very well. He took magic very seriously. He didn't mean, the sleight of hand magic, the performer on stage. He meant living in life, living our daily lives magically. To do things, live in such a way that what we get what we want, we create our culture more through magic than by conscious effort. For example, he would suggest the use of music for magical purposes. Like if we were meeting in his place to talk about the soul, we would have to have musicians present. Well, we have had some here, but we would have to be playing as we talked. Music has a magical possibilities, as we saw in that film clip of how the two aspects of the film look different when you had different music behind it. He would call that magical. And if we understood, he said, if we understood the principles of magic, we could accomplish a great deal more in our lives than if we tried to be rational about it all. That's how imagination and magic come into it. But he says, he called it natural magic, and his thought was that nature supports us and gives us all we need to be who we are. Nature, but we have to tap into nature. So magic, he calls it natural magic, we tap into the power of nature. And instead of trying to do things alone on ourselves, we tap into nature. So very practically, I'll tell you what he suggests. He suggests he was an astrologer, which is another problem today because we don't understand the importance of astrology, but I can't get into all that tonight. But he was an astrologer, and he thought that what we ought to do is diagnose our situation astrologically. And I'm saying tonight, I'm going to tell you that we don't have enough Venus in our culture. That's what I'm going to be telling you. We don't have enough Venus. He would say, okay, if you diagnose your situation as not having enough Venus, you need to eat some Venusian food. You need to dress in Venusian colors. You need to go to some Venusian places. You need to really cultivate this thing. So that, for him, that was magical. And he would say, if you need some Venus, get a painting of Venus and put it in your room and relate to it. Don't just say this is some artist and talk about the artist. Who cares about the artist's life? This is a real thing. This is a painting there. These are characters. Interact with them. Open up your heart and your mind and your imagination. Let them come off those paintings. Let them live. Does that sound crazy? I'm afraid that the trouble is, if you want to bring soul into life, it's going to make your life less rational. There's no other way around it. It's going to have to be less rational. That's the way it works. So a soulful life is a different form of life than we are cultivating. Another thing about soul is that you might say that the primary work of the soul, the primary desire of soul is connection. Not knowledge, but connection. It wants to be connected. Now your mind might want some knowledge, but the soul wants to be connected to whatever it is you're studying, or connected to the person teaching you, or connected to the book you're reading, or connected to the place where you're doing it. Do you know what it's like when you go to study something and you go off to some other place and you love the place? From the point of view of soul, if you want to really nurture your soul, the thing to do would be to cultivate that connection and not just go there and forget about the place and fill your mind with thoughts. The soul operates at a different level. And the soul is what makes us alive, gives us our life and vitality. The traditional teaching was the soul makes us human and the soul gives us our individuality. So it's very important to care for that soul. Without it, we end up with all kinds of problems. If you don't have a deep sense of soul, if you don't live from that soul, you probably are not going to have a good identity, a good sense of self, and then narcissism kind of creeps in. It gets to be a big problem. Trying to find your way and trying to feel okay about what you're doing and all of that. So there are a lot of problems when you don't care for a soul. I've been saying for years that it's time to stop trying to patch up our problems and start out by just knowing that there's something in us that's very deep and mysterious and invisible that needs to be cared for, or we're in trouble. And this is not a new idea. We're going back thousands of years talking about the soul, the human soul. So that's the context of all of this. That if we have concrete ways of taking care of the life of the soul, it may seem strange to your friends. So you come to a conference and you don't attend a session. I talked to somebody here. They didn't attend a session because they had to go walk by the river at that time. To me, that's great. The thing is, when you're taking care of the soul, your plans have to go off to the side a little bit. And expectations of other people have to be kind of placed in a context. Because right now you have to say, look, I'm sorry, I have to take care of this thing. I can hear it. I can feel it in me. There's a need in me now. I have to respond to it. And I can't just put it off for an hour. I'm sorry. It doesn't work that way. You put it off for an hour, you're going to forget about it. So this caring for the soul creates a rather interesting life. It's not easy to adapt. Marriage is very interesting when you're living this way. Because, when you're caring for that soul of yours and trying to live with another person who has a very deep, mysterious, crazy kind of dimension to them, you have to accept the fact that you're going to be in an odd situation the rest of your life. And I don't understand all of these workshops people give, for marriage to try to help people be more rational about their marriages. Like to communicate. I've never understood the need to communicate in marriage. I just don't get it because the soul, this deep thing in us is so deep and so mysterious and powerful, and it makes us so big and so individual. How can you communicate about that? How can you reduce it to saying, tell me what you're thinking, Well, what do you want? I don't know. Have you ever been in that situation? Well, what do you want? Tell me what you want. I don't know what I want. That's a perfectly legitimate place to be. I don't know what I want. That's the nature of the soul. It's so vast, you don't know what those desires are. There are desires deep within us for a long time, for years. We don't know exactly where they're headed. So I say, forget communication myself. I'd say, try something else, some other way of being together that doesn't necessitate making, these things clear. Grunt or move around or, paint your face, do something, but don't try to communicate. So the soul has a different, way of operating altogether. It's a whole different, but very real needs, but very, very different. I've learned most of this from my psychotic patients, I have to admit. But wonderful, wonderful people, who just have never been understood before. There's something else I wanted to tell you about the soul. The soul has a very close relationship to desire. Very, very close relationship to desire, I thought that was still up here, sex, pleasure, intimacy, beauty. The soul has a very close relationship to that. Now I'm going to tell you just a little story about that. A number of years ago I was in Rome, and I made my own little pilgrimage, a small one, to the Museo Capitolino. I wanted to go there to pay homage at the sculpture of Venus that is at that place, because that is one of the most important, one of the most influential, powerful Venuses that was ever made, and it's there in Rome, the Capitolino Venus. So I went up there, but as I was heading, I finally got to her, but as I was going to the third floor of that place to see her, on the second floor I was walking down this very wide marble corridor, and at the end of the corridor I couldn't believe my eyes what was there. I knew it because I had seen pictures of it. There was a sculpture there of two young people. The sculpture was about maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, and there were two young people caressing each other, just about to kiss, with one, with each having their arm around the other, very delicate, these curls in their hair, and all in stone, and just very delicately holding each other. And you know who those two were? Psyche and Eros. Do you know who Psyche and Eros are? Psyche is the soul. Eros is pleasure, sensuality, lust, desire, pleasure. What did I say? I keep saying pleasure. This is who we have there in that sculpture. We have the soul yearning for desire and lust and sensuality, and we have desire and pleasure and sexuality yearning for soul in that sculpture. It's a magnificent sculpture. I don't know what you could have more precious than that image of what is going on within us in our society and in ourselves. Our soul longs for pleasure. Our soul longs for a sexual fulfillment, and I want to say what I mean by that later. Our soul longs for the ability to feel desire and to feel our lusts and to feel our attractions without feeling bad about them. I think our soul longs for these things. Now, I'm not suggesting at all any kind of immorality in this. In fact, just the opposite. There's a kind of morality that comes out of that acceptance of desire that is much stronger, much more, in fact, somewhere more limiting in many ways than that other kind that is sheer repression. There's a huge difference between repressing these desires and allowing them their place and then finding that they have their limits. And they're okay. It's all right to love, to have your soul love all of those feelings and those desires. And it's all right to have those desires as long as they have a soul, because they need the soul for completion. We should all go now, shouldn't we, to Rome and bow down before that sculpture of Psyche and Eros. Now, I'd like to go back to one of my other dead friends for a minute. Epicurus. Epicurus was a philosopher born in the year 341 BC, a long time ago. And he became a philosopher. He traveled a little bit. Then he settled in Athens. And he created a school of philosophy it's usually called the Garden School, because his friends would meet in this garden of his house. I've often imagined it, with lettuce and cucumbers around, like a Greek salad, They're sitting there in this Greek salad discussing desire and pleasure. And interestingly, Epicurus, his group included men and women, free people and slaves. It was an all-inclusive group, and equals of equals. Epicurus himself was known as a very kind, gentle, moderate, very, very moderate person. We have one statement about him. He asked a friend, he said, just bring me half a pound of cheese and I'll be feasting for the next month. And he was not, we think of Epicureanism as overeating and indulgence. It has nothing to do with Epicurus whatsoever. Epicurus' philosophy and his way of life was extremely moderate. He said you can't have pleasure unless the people around you also have pleasure. We have to have a community. We have to be responsible to the people with us before we can have pleasure. He said that there are pleasures that are very natural. There are pleasures that are necessary, like food and sleep and other things, sex. And there are pleasures that aren't necessary, like what's it called, a Lamborghini or something. You don't need a really fancy car. There are things we don't need, we might like, and they please us, but those are not necessary pleasures. He said there are kinetic pleasures and there are static pleasures. That means, he says, there are some pleasures that you enjoy as you're doing them, and then they're kind of over, and there are other pleasures you have that just stay with you forever, or for a long time. Those are static or stable pleasures. And he mentioned, and he said, and everyone down in history who followed him said that the number one pleasure in life is friendship. And all the Epicureans, when you look in the history of Epicurean writing, they all talk about friendship. Ficino, who was an Epicurean, wrote letter after letter about the qualities of friendship and how to cultivate friendships and how important it was to cultivate friendship. He even wrote one letter called the Convivium, which means to live together, convivial. He wrote one letter on how to gather together convivially and how to get your friends together. He wrote a letter and he even tells you what kind of food to get and how to plan your party and all of this. Because friendship is the number one thing. Just think of it. When you have a friend, this is a stable pleasure. This is not something you just have and you have for a moment, but it's a stable pleasure. That's how he looked at it. Now, it's my view, it's my sense that when we don't allow ourselves, for one reason or another, the stable, necessary, ordinary pleasures of life, bad things happen. I think it breeds violence. I think that breeds violence. You can't get away with just not having those pleasures. It's not like saying, well, I just don't have those in my life. What happens, you don't have them, there are results. There's a response, there's a consequence to not having those pleasures. And what are those consequences? One might be depression. Remember, it's the soul that gives a sense of vitality. And the soul loves desire and pleasure. Remember the statue of Eros and Psyche. You don't give the soul its pleasure, I think that's a cause of depression, a major cause of depression. And we have a lot of depressed people in this world. We have a lot of depressed, wealthy people with good jobs, going to work every day, with families, all of those things, but depressed. What's that depression? Not because of it for any external reason, because they've got everything they need, it seems. I think they don't have the deep pleasure that Epicurus was talking about. Those pleasures are so important. That deep pleasure, the sensuality, being in a body, and living in a body, and enjoying a body, and living as so much as Satish was saying, letting that joy and that pleasure be part of everything that is done. We don't do that. I don't think we do it generally. And I think that depression is one possible reaction. Another is violence. There's a long, long tradition. It's usually expressed in imagistic terms. Mostly Platonists have explored this. In imagistic terms. Maybe you know the painting of Botticelli that's in London called the Mars and Venus. It shows Mars, who is this figure who has its own importance. It's very important to have a Mars spirit, certainly. To have a warrior spirit and be strong and all those good things. But that can easily get hyperactivated, and people go a little too far with that, much too far with it. So the ancient tradition is Venus is the one who can calm Mars. And that's what that painting shows in London. It shows Mars just having made love with Venus. Can you imagine this? Just having made love with Venus. This is not just ordinary partner. Just having made love with Venus. And where is he's lying there and his helmet's half off his head and his weapons are lying around next to him, and they have these little fairy-like figures are playing with his weapons, and there's Venus with a little smile on her face just there sitting on the side. It's a beautiful painting of this great mystery. I was in London I think it was about a year and a half ago, with my family. We were in that room. They were sketching a painting, and I heard a docent coming to talk to teach a group about this painting of Mars and Venus, and I thought, I'm going to rush over there and hear what she has to say about it, because I think this is one of the most important paintings in the world, talking about the relation between pleasure, desire, and violence. So I listened in, and she said, notice his brush strokes, and that's all it was. It was all about brush strokes, and I was waiting, dying to hear about Mars and Venus. I think we've lost our sense of what art is. We think it's brush strokes. They're important. I live with a painter. I know they're very important, but they're not that important compared to the great mystery that is taking place in them. That's an icon. That painting should be a painting of pilgrimage. Especially today, we should be going to that painting and wondering, what is this great mystery? Is there some way that Venus is involved in our warfare? Among the Greeks, there's story after story of people who have neglected the worship of Venus. Story after story. And you know what Venus does? She gets even. There's one of the great plays, I think one of the great plays, one of the great tragedies is called Hippolytus. It means horse loose. Like when a person's horse is loose in them, that kind of thing. You know what that's like? Anyway, what happened was that there's this young man, Hippolytus, who wants to be pure. He doesn't want to have anything to do with all that Venusian stuff. He wants to be a pure person. You know, there's still a lot of people around this world today who are like Hippolytus. They don't want to be touched by sensuality and sexuality and all that stuff. They want to be pure. Or if they're going to do it, they're going to do it privately and not talk about it and pretend they don't. You know, they want to be pure of clean of all of that. Well, what happens? The play Hippolytus opens with Venus appearing on the stage. And she tells the people who are listening at the theater, which is a sacred theater, remember, a sacred theater. And she says to them, to the audience, she says, I don't mind if anyone wants to worship Artemis, the virgin goddess, and all of that purity, it's wonderful, great. She's my sister, it's fine. But if you do that and ignore me, you're asking for trouble. And as a result, then, this terrible tragedy develops where Venus causes his stepmother to fall in love with him, and in the end, he's killed by his horses. Interestingly, in Christianity, later there was a Saint Hippolytus who was killed by horses. Figure that one out. Anyway, my point is that even the Greeks understood so many times, I shouldn't say even the Greeks understood and expressed it so many times, that there is this tight relationship between violence and pleasure. There's a close relation. You ignore pleasure. See, Venus is saying, you repress me, and you're in trouble. I don't think we understand that these days. And part of it comes, my experience as a psychotherapist for about 30 years, my experience, based on that experience, I would say most of that repression of Venus comes from the kind of religion we have had, the fear of sexuality in religion that we've had. Most of what I see, people almost invariably will say, I grew up in a religion where the pastor or the priest or the preacher or somebody, the minister, the rabbi, made me feel bad about my sexuality. I hear that over and over and over and over again. Once in a while, people wake up and discover that it's okay to be a sexual person. But I think the majority don't. And so do you see what I'm trying to get at with the logic of this? The repression of all of that sexuality leads to violence. I think it mysteriously leads to violence. Because we are meant to be joyous, pleasure-loving, in a deep way, pleasure-loving people. And you have all these, parents and churches and everyone telling you, yes, you're a sexual person, you have all those feelings and thoughts and everything, but they keep telling you that's not good, it's not right, you shouldn't have that. There's no positive guidance, very little positive guidance in our sexuality. Tremendous amount of guilt and repression. I think that contributes enormously to the misery on our planet today, and in a large measure to the violence that we have. It's a direct connection from one to the other. And another thing that happens is curious and is confusing to a lot of people. But this is plain classical Freudian psychology. What happens when you repress Venus, she doesn't go away. Another thing that happens is that she acts up, and you get a hyper-sexualized society. You see what I mean? You get a symptomatic expression of sex, like sex on the internet. I think it's great to have sex on the internet myself, but do I have to get raw sex every time I plug in anything, type in any word practically, because almost any word in the language has sexual overtones. I mean, it's exaggerated. And all of our movies, it's very hard for me. I think that there is a point to having, like with children, my daughter's 13, to honor the virginal aspects of this child at that age. It's very hard for us to find a movie that's not, not symptomatically sexual. So I think we exaggerate our sexuality because we are overly preoccupied with sex because we don't have it. Because we aren't sexual enough. So I'm advocating more sex. That's why I agreed to this program this program I'm doing on HBO is produced by Kim Cattrall, who was on the Sex and the City. And we did this filming in Toronto. And the last time I was in Toronto, I was interviewed. I don't know why, I'm just a modest former monk, but I was interviewed by this, I know, believe that, huh? Interviewed by this television station they have there. It's a nude newscast. I mean, the presenters are nude, and everything's about sex. And I went in there to talk. The question, I wouldn't even tell you the questions they asked me. I turn red right now. But, because I'm bashful and shy about these things. Even so, I think that it's important that we acknowledge this thing, because I think it's killing us. And I saw this in therapy. What I saw in therapy was people came into therapy with me, and they would 8 times out of 10 would have a sexual problem to present. A relationship. The most common was, someone who's in a marriage and has kids and is attracted to a third party, and what to do. Should I repress my desire to be with another person? Should I kill my family by leaving it? They present this terrible dilemma. Well, I realized after a while that the dilemma is there only because that's where we are in life. We only see sex in such a limited way. We don't enjoy the fullness of sexuality. It's like Satish was saying, we don't really appreciate the spiritual and deep aspects of our sexuality. So I'm not talking about biological sex. There is no such thing for a human being. There is no such thing. Yes, there's a biological aspect, but no, there's no such thing as biological sex, because human beings are not just biological. We have a soul. We have an imagination. We have tender feelings and powerful feelings. We have passions. We have to take those things into account. Let me give you, before I get really on a tirade here, I'll save that for a little bit later. Just a little digression. I work a lot with hospitals and doctors and medical schools and that sort of thing. And one of the things I tell the medical students and the doctors, I ask them, I say, what image of the human body do you have in your office, in your consulting room? And some say, well, we have a skeleton. And I say, well, I'm sorry I can't go to you, because I am not a skeleton. I'm a flesh and blood person. Yes, there's a skeleton there, but if your image of who I am is the skeleton hanging, I don't want it, sorry. I don't want to be friends with that guy hanging there on the door. So someone else says, well, I have plastic organs. I have these beautiful plastic, intestines and things. I say, no, I won't go to you, because I don't want you to look at my body and see plastic organs. That's not who I am. That's not what I am and who I am. I'm not that. And so they'll say, okay, all right, we'll have this picture like Vitruvian Man of Da Vinci, a whole person out there. And I say, you'll never catch me looking like that. I am Plan B, I am not this glorious Vitruvian Man. I'm not. I've never have been. I always wish I were. I try to go to the gym sometimes to look like it, but I've never been able to pull it off. So, no, I'm Plan B, or C even maybe. I'm very down on the order of that muscular, wonderful figure of Vitruvian Man. So it can't be that. And he says, well, what do you want? I say to them, give me an image in your room. If you have an image in your consulting room of a person, a real person, in a place with other persons or another person doing something, I will come to you, because that's what a human being is. That's an ensouled human being. Whenever we take the soul away, we end up with these skeletons and these travesties of what a human being is. So this notion of soul has all kinds of implications, all sorts of implications of what we can do and where we can go with it. And there's another notion here I want to connect with it, one more little piece to this puzzle that I'm giving you. And that is that it seems to me that that our desire, our sense of beauty, our sensuality, our joy, our bodies, our interactions, our attractions, that all of these things all make up our sexuality. They all make up our sexuality. So if I say, before I say we need more sex, I don't mean more lovemaking, although that's not a bad idea, but what I mean is a more erotic world. That's what I mean. A more erotic world. Now, I can say this, I think, a little more. I don't know if I'm going to get caught in cultural things here, because I can speak more easily to Americans about this because I know what's going on there. But I tell you, I spent a lot of time in Ireland, and one of the things I love to do in Ireland is go to one of these beautiful old bridges. I know they're here in the city here too, beautiful bridges, and Rome has them. Ireland has these country bridges that are just beautiful. And I've seen people sitting on those bridges having a picnic. Or I've seen lovers making out on the bridge. Now then I go home to America, and I ask myself, am I ever going to see people picnicking on an overpass? When those people design these huge overpasses, these huge highways with these bridges today, do they ever think about people having a picnic on them? Do they ever think about lovers needing a place to go to meet privately and quietly? Do we ever think about that? For millennia, people have gone to bridges for this purpose. See how crazy this is when you start talking about the soul? I'm suggesting that we eroticize our bridges. I mean it too. I'm serious about it. That's the worst thing. I mean that we need to eroticize everything we do, or else Venus will get upset. We need to eroticize everything we do, everything we do, everything. Everything. Your home, your furniture, your food, your clothing, your language, the way you spend your time, the workplace. I wrote an article about this for Mother Jones magazine, which is a very radical magazine in the United States, once about sexualizing the workplace. And all the workers wrote me, and they were really happy about that. They reproduced this thing, and all the owners and the managers, no, they were afraid all these affairs are going to take place. I think the affairs take place on the job because they're not erotic enough. I mean, I know what it's like. I lived at, oh boy, I'm confessing. Howard, where are you? He was confessing too. It must be something about the stage. You start confessing when you stand up here. It's that light. Anyway, my confession is that when I was a young man, I was a monk. I was in a religious order for about 12 or 13 years, and I found that living in that life, I loved it. I mean, it's a very wonderful community life. Community living was wonderful in it. But I did find that since I was not deeply in my soul called to be celibate for the rest of my life, I found it difficult at moments. And I could feel that eruption in me of sex saying, ooh, look at me. As a therapist, I've seen many people have dreams at this moment, and a serpent comes out of the water and looks at them. I know what that serpent is. It says, don't forget about me. You're not getting any further unless you pay attention to me. So I know what it's like to be in an environment that they try as hard as they can to make it sexless. And then the dragons of sex begin stirring. And so I can understand in the workplace. They try to make them sexless, don't they? Or maybe they don't try, they just do it because it's just automatic. I think that's the way they should be. I mean, just think of the chairs people sit on. I think this way. I go into offices, I'm thinking, I'm observing. I go into offices and I look around and I see what kind of chairs people are sitting on. I think, can human beings sit on those chairs 8 hours a day and still be sexual? You know, I mean, and still be erotic? Can they do it? What about the time schedule? Don't they have time a little bit of time to, you know, to get into their body, to see nature, the body of nature? And what about food? You have time to eat, you have good food and some pleasant surroundings, a really good place to eat. Pleasurable place, not just functional, pleasurable. Look at those cafeterias where people eat in, wherever you call them, in workplaces. I mean, would you want to have your lover come there? This is the criterion for everything. Would you have your lover come there? Ask that about your boss someday. Ask your boss. Say, my lover would not like to join me here at this place. Well, see, that's really talking about the soul, because soul and eros are hand in hand. They're hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. You repress eros, the soul goes away. It's a very serious problem. It's very, very serious. So that would be my solution. Only one. I mean, I admire tremendously what other people have said here. Today I was incredibly inspired by the speakers talking about the ways of dealing with human misery and expanding the imagination of what we're doing. So this is only a piece, but I think it's a piece that's neglected quite often. And it's like, you know, they keep saying the elephant in the room, sex. You know, isn't it? I mean, it's not a small thing. It's not this little thing that you can just ignore and say, well, I'm not interested in that. Everyone's interested in sex. It's a powerful thing. It's a wonderful thing. And it's bigger, though. It's bigger than just the way we've imagined it. It has to do with being erotic in a general way in everything we do. Erotic. And going out of our way to eroticize what we do. I try to do that in my books. You know, it's my little way of trying to do it. My publishers don't understand me half the time, you know, about this. In fact, I wrote a book called The Soul of Sex, and I made a cover for them that had this beautiful painting of Adam and Eve, painted by Lucas Cranach, who's a wonderful painter, you know, and very austere, beautiful, gorgeous, and even with fig leaves. There were fig leaves on it. And the publisher said, too sexy. And I said, what are you talking about? The book is called The Soul of Sex. You know? And he said, too sexy, nobody will buy it. I said, it's not true. He said, all right, we'll try it. Well, they tried it, and we immediately got word from one of the major publishers, a major bookseller, said that they would not receive the book. They will not sell it in their bookstores because people will be embarrassed walking out with it. And I couldn't understand that, because I've seen lots of books that are very sexy going out of the bookstores. But anyway, the point is, I think there is that confusion. There's a great confusion about sexuality. We're very interested in sex, but we're not comfortable. And I think we're not comfortable with it because we've kept it in such a small little room for so long. It needs to come out. We need to eroticize everything we do. I do the same, I try to do the same with language. If I have a choice between a clear word and a sensuous word, I'll choose the sensuous one in every case. Because I think that's where the soul comes into the writing. Now that's for me, I'm a writer, that's my business. You can look at your business and ask the same question. Can I do this thing efficiently, or can I do it erotically? Or maybe both. But if there's a choice, I would always say go with the erotic, because that gives soul to what you're doing. Eros and soul go together. Understand? Okay, can we stop and have a conversation now? Because I'd like to talk about this. I'd much rather talk about it with you than keep going on trying to beat the dead horse.
Okay, got it.
I think I've made my point.
Okay, who wants to talk about sex?
Well, I don't want to talk about sex. I've had 56 years growing up with the Roman Catholic tradition. So I'd like you, if you could, to elaborate. When you keep saying the word erotic, that's sending off all kinds of buzzers and bells in my head. But how would you make an office or your home more erotic? Are you talking about like meeting your husband at the door, with a negligee, or hanging,
No.
red light bulbs? I mean,
No.
what?
No. See, that's why why I wanted to have a conversation?
Well, no, this is what I'm saying. I need a definition for erotic. That's what I need.
A definition for erotic. Yes, I know. I gave a talk like this once to a group of all men, businessmen, and they all came up to me and said, "We can't invite you ever again. You use the word eros. Sexy, it's slimy." I don't mean that. Eros, I better say something more then. Again, going back to the Greeks, because it's a Greek word, eros, I should say. It's an omega, right? An omega. Eros. Let's say among certain Greeks, the Greek religion, the Orphics especially, for the Orphics, Eros was the god who brought all of life into being. And it is Eros, this is a very old tradition, carrying on down the line in European philosophy as well, that Eros is what holds the planets in their orbits. It's Eros that does that. So Eros is conceived in a very, very broad fashion, meaning any kind of connection, attraction, magnetism, being within the ambit of someone, connected instead of distant and apart and abstract, physically, sensually connected in some way. So it has been reduced because of this repression, I think, to this Eros meaning something slimy or, not very, very nice. Actually, it's a very moral, very ethical, very ennobling kind of notion, it seems to me. So how would you eroticize your home? Well, there are several. I could give several suggestions, but they're things anyone would know. Make a habit of always having fresh flowers somewhere, so that when you walk in the room, you smell the flowers. So this is and you're stopped by them. And you can have, if you're really good at it, you can have a flower or a display of flowers that would you couldn't go past them. You have to stop and look, or you'd just be captivated by them. There's an erotic thing. Another thing might be to set up your home so that whoever comes into it wants to be there. See, it's about connection and desire and pleasure, so that you choose furniture that people want to sit in. Do you ever go into friends' houses and you'd rather stand? That's what I'm talking about. And I don't mean expense. I'm not talking about the big expense. I'm just saying pay attention to sensuality. Pay attention to the sensuality of the situation. We just don't understand, I think, how these very simple, ordinary things can either be functional or erotic. And when you make them a little bit erotic meaning pleasurable, simply pleasurable. But there's something else I would suggest. As you keep doing this, and I can see that in the workplace, have some good color, not just white everywhere. I went to a business once, a very large corporation, and the owner or the CEO refused to allow any color in anyone's offices. Everything had to be white. Boy, if that isn't Artemis, that white thing, that pure white, purity everywhere, the guy was nuts, and he was creating problems for his workers. He wouldn't let them have plants. Plants and vegetables are erotic. Plants are erotic as well as flowers. Just the choice of plants, good. Mike, it doesn't take much, does it, to find a good phallic symbol in a plant or a good, vaginal image in a plant? You could do it that way. You don't have to tell anyone about it. Just let them wonder as they walk by. You can insinuate the erotic, and sometimes it can be more obviously sexual. Yes, I personally think I think it's quite nice to have to have a nude or two, or around the house. My wife's a painter, and she paints a lot of nudes. Some of the parents of my kids' friends won't let them stay at our house because there's so many nudes around the house. We overdo it a little bit, but I'm saying you could have one. You could have one erotic painting, in a nice place. We have I got one of these sculptures, one of these Tibetan sculptures of, the two, the dakinis, an embrace. And now we didn't want our kids to be looking at that all day long. So we put it up in a little cabinet in our bathroom, where my wife and I's in our bathroom, and we can look at that all the time. It eroticizes the room. A bathroom is a great place to eroticize. With oils and colors and plants, and you know how to do it. But you could go much further than you think you should. Eroticism has to be excessive, or else it looks like there's artismus has come in to tidy things up. So it has to have a little excess. You know what William Blake, who knew all this, Blake knew all of this, I'm saying today. William Blake said, the road of excess is the palace of wisdom. So that's what's required as well. Did that help a little? We have some
all right, over here.
Daring people over here.
All right. I'll get him and I'll be right back to you.
Hey, get out of the light.
Yeah, thank you. Lovely to hear all that. And a big ho for loads of good sex. And at all ages.
Please.
We're not dead till we're dead.
Please.
And what I wanted I grew up with a personal internal war. You talked about violence. I grew up with internal violence between the me that I really was, I'm talking about adolescence, 20s, and the effect of the religion I like to call Christianity.
Yes.
And but there's one thing that's got missed in our culture.
Was that Christianity?
No, Christianity.
Oh, Christianity, okay.
It's a much better phrase.
I like it. Okay.
It's accurate.
But I also like Christianity, but that's all right.
Yeah. The two can live side by side.
Yes.
Puberty rights.
Yes.
Something happened to puberty rights. Mm-hmm. And our lack of freedom and our repression and all the needs are not addressed at puberty. How can we get puberty rights back?
Well, that's the question. The general question is an awfully difficult one. People often ask, we don't have primal rights anymore. The usual, initiation rights, we don't have those. So what should we do, make them up? And people do try to create new rituals, but somehow they don't have, at least as I see them generally, they don't have the grip that, that maybe a real primitive ritual would have. So what can we do with that? I think that we're in a point now where we can be less literal about all these things. I mean, it's very difficult to say. It makes sense that if you really want to initiate someone into their sexuality, to wear masks and beat drums and all, it's great. I mean, that really, it gets through to you. But I think there are other ways to be got through, too. In other words, there are ways to help our children go through their passages in life. That's a very important thing to do, obviously, very important thing to do. How would you do that? I think that, I'm like Ficino. Ficino was a kind of a fastidious person. He didn't go in for real raw stuff. He was kind of gentle about things. I'm like him. I would suggest, the attitude that you have as parents, if you really could deal with your inhibition, not inhibition, because inhibition is important, with the repression that you have had. If you have had parents, like for example, I grew up in an Irish American Catholic family. I never heard the word sex ever. I think till I was 30 or something. No, probably 17. But nobody talked about it. If they did, there was a hush in the room. What was said? What was that? Just the word itself. I know what that's like. And I have to deal with it. I have to live with it myself. I have a lot of that in me, that Roman Catholic inhibition in me, certainly. And one way to deal with it is to go into the opposite extreme, which I'm doing tonight. Just you take it on and you just go in there and talk about it. Or another way, I think, the fact is, this is a psychological statement, it is possible to deal with those repressive influences in our individual lives. It is possible. How do you do it? The word that has come up over and over and over again in these meetings, conversation. The talking therapy works when it's not too heroic and not too medical and all that. When it's just conversation. You can find people to talk to. You say, look, I was brought up in a Roman Catholic family. I've got a lot of discomfort around this talk of eroticism. Find a good friend, someone you can really talk to. Remember Epicurus, a friendship? Find a good friend that you can talk to and say, you know, I've never told anyone this before, but I really feel tight inside because of the way I was brought up. I feel uneasy about sex. Let me tell you a story about this. A few years ago, I was on a radio show to talk about the relationship between sexuality and spirituality. It was a call-in program, radio program. A woman called in, and maybe, I don't know how many people are listening, a few thousand probably, and it was in a big city area, and she said, she told us, the interviewer and I, she said, you know, until this conversation today, I have never allowed myself to be a sexual woman. She said, I was brought up in my church and in my family who was influenced by the church that it was most important to be spiritual, and in order to be spiritual, I really couldn't accept and really lived in my sexuality. But she said, today I've heard permission for myself today, and she says, I'm saying this on the radio to whoever is listening, this is the end of it. I think she felt a need to be able to say this to as many people as she could have at the moment and say, I'm not doing this anymore. I've heard that from many people. I'm not doing this anymore. You can just finally it dawns on you that it's not necessary to live forever in that repression, whether it's a heavy repression or a light one. Now, there are a lot of people who are also dealing with sexual abuse, and that takes a lot to deal with that, to feel comfortable with Eros. And I've worked a lot with people in that situation, and it can be done. It can be done. But I'm not saying one conversation, one radio program is going to work for anybody. But if you can find people to talk to and have that kind of talk that when you speak, it's like a door opens. I don't mean confessing everything and just letting your whole heart hang out. I don't mean that kind of thing where you just blob everything, you know, throw up everything. What I mean is kind of a door opens, and one that you've kept closed, and from that, it's like a heart thing, isn't it? The door opens and you're able to make a heart connection and let some of that worry out. Not all of it. You don't have to say everything, but let as much out as seems okay at this moment, and then close the door. Because it's also important to be private and to honor the inhibition. Very important to honor our inhibitions. That's different from repression. Very important to be inhibited where we need to be inhibited. But I think we can deal with those problems.
Thank you. Seems to me in the United States, unlike the rest of the world, we have this total schism between being oversexed on one side, sex sell advertisement, you know, et cetera, right. And the Puritanism that comes from our history.
Yes.
And it's refreshing to come to another part of the world where I don't at least observe the same kind of hang-up that we have in the United States. How do we begin the dialogue in the United States to integrate the two polarities that we seem to have around sex?
Well, first of all, let me check that out. England doesn't have a problem here? No. Okay. Well, how do we address that problem? I think, let me see. See, the thing is, I think the way to address it is as Satish was saying before, that it has to be done within yourself. I mean, I don't think it helps to try to reform a country. There's some people maybe are called to do that, but I think most of us have to really start with ourselves. So what can you do? You can do this. And I get this way of thinking from the Greek context, where they had a polytheistic religion, where you could honor Artemis and Venus. In fact, you should bring a sacrifice or say prayers to both Artemis and Venus, both to your purity and to your sexuality, both. How can you be pure and sexual at the same time? That's a good question, but it's not something that can't be done. I can tell you how not to do it. you don't do it by trying to resolve it in your head. You don't try to resolve it rationally, how you can be purely sexual. There's a woman who, a theologian, wrote a book called Pure Lust. I don't know if you can really do that. But I think what you can do is find ways of honoring, don't go against your inhibition or your reserve or your desire to be innocent. Don't give up your innocence. I think our innocence is absolutely important to us. It matures over time, but it's very important to have it. So we honor our innocence and our purity, and with that, we go and be as sexual as we can be. You do both. And if you feel the sexuality is getting a little out of hand, the thing to do is just to go deeper into it and eroticize more. That's what I would say. You don't try to repress it from some other place. If you're using your purity to repress your sexuality, that's a dualism. That is psychologically a mess. It doesn't work. What you have to do is honor your sexuality, honor your purity, and be both. Be a complex person. Don't be a simple person. Be complex. Don't just join all those people that are just able to be so free about their sexuality. Maybe that's not who you are. And it's not the same for everybody. And I think a person could be celibate, like a priest or someone who just chooses to be a celibate or who's by circumstances celibate at this particular moment in life, and be thoroughly sexual and devoted to Venus. There's no reason why you can't. You don't have to be making love. You don't have to have a partner in order to be sexual. But you have to work these things out for yourself. But I think you honor everything. You honor all of it. And that's a real secret, if you can get this point, to live polytheistically. Meaning that you honor the deep, by theism, the deep, deep calls, the deep call within yourself for various things. The call to be pure, the call to be sexual, the call to travel, the call to work in a certain way, the call for service. Honor all of those things and make this interesting web of what a personality is, of who you are. It'll be entirely different, it'll be unique like nobody else's. So I can't give a general tonic of how to do this, but you can look at your life that way and work it out.
One more here.
I just wanted your thoughts on what it is about the spontaneous source of joy, which, I liked your idea about honoring whatever is there. And for somebody like myself who meditates, it's very much about accepting whatever comes up for you, your thoughts, your feelings, your body sensations. So that is fine, but some of what you said felt a little bit prescriptive, that one should try and be erotic or whatever. What I'm trying to say is, I like the idea of honoring whatever comes up for oneself. And where is the place of a spontaneous source of joy, which may be beyond what is, sensuality, or
yes.
If it is there in the body, fine, but not as a prescriptive something that we have to be a certain way.
Mm-hmm. It's a little hard for me to understand quickly what it is you're talking about. I know at the superficial level that I, having been a monk, that I get moralistic easily. I mean, moralistic in favor of sex, sometimes. So that's possible, if that's what you mean by prescriptive. I don't mean to do that. I mean to trying to suggest that there are ways that we could deal with our repressions and their influences that have made us feel uncomfortable with pleasure and with all those things associated with Eros. Now, I think what you're suggesting is that you don't want to have a rule telling you, well, now you should be more erotic or anything like that, but you want a more spontaneous joy. The capacity for joy that is spontaneous just comes out of you, rises out of you. I think one thing that might be possible there is it's possible to, one thing is simply to try to forgive yourself. I mean, that's the first thing you might want to do. I think a lot of us are inhibited from that spontaneous joy from the need for forgiveness for past mistakes. Now that may not be your experience, but I think it is for a lot of people. And there's a need to forgive ourselves, especially in the area of sexuality, because the thing is, there's no right way to do it. You know, there's no way to get through this thing, as far as I can see, and do it correctly, and without making a lot of mistakes, without hurting people, without hurting yourself, without being stupid sometimes. I don't think there's any way to do it other than that. So we need a lot of forgiveness for our sexuality, and I see that people find it difficult to forgive themselves. That's one thing. So that might help. Just find it within ourselves to forgive ourselves for the mistakes we've made, and then kind of be freed of that, to go on, and maybe the spontaneity would come out more easily. Another possibility is that, I'll tell you a line from Wallace Stevens, a great American poet, wonderful American poet. He said, "The death of one God is the death of them all." The death of one God is the death of them all. So what I'm suggesting here is that dealing with the spontaneity of your desire and pleasure, you may have to deal with some other God, some other thing, some other sphere of life, because the death of one is the death of them all. They influence each other. So in order to feel that spontaneity that you want and that joy that you can't get in touch with, you might want to take a look at some things that don't seem related to it. For example, I find myself as a therapist again, I'll work with married couples, and they come into therapy and they want to discuss, their interactions and their history, and they want to see who wins out constantly. And nothing comes of all of that. And I will say sometimes, how are things at work? And they say, work? We're talking about our marriage. But you see, things at work, see what I mean? The death of one God is the death of them all. You kill off the God of work. If your work is not in good condition, your erotic life suffers. And all that spontaneity and all that passion is going to be affected by it. So that, you see what I mean? You have to look at the full scope of what's going on. And in a society as well, I think, we have to look at the whole scope. The question was about American Puritanism. Well, where does it show itself? One place that shows itself in America is, and I imagine increasingly elsewhere, is that we work too hard. People, everywhere I go, people are saying both couples in a family or in a marriage are working in order to be able to sustain the lifestyle they want or they need. They're working all the time, and they're working too much, too many hours a day. They don't have much time off. What's going on there? That there's something. The work thing is what has to be looked at for Eros. I think maybe if you could resolve the work issue, the sex would be great. It's the work thing. The death of this God affects the death of the other God. So we have to look around. You can't I think the modern tendency is to see the problem and try to fix it right where it is. If it's a carburetor, you fix that. If it's sex, you fix that. It might be somewhere else altogether. It might be in the spiritual life. You might need, I really believe this, that if your spirituality is comfortable, your sexuality is going to be much better. And I have no doubt whatsoever about that, and vice versa. If your sexuality is comfortable, your spirituality is going to be a lot better off. No question about that at all. So that may be the answer to that. It's one answer to what you're asking about. Are we finished?